Halo, halo, tu Warszawa i wszystkie rozgłośnie Polskiego Radia. Dziś rano o godzinie 5:40 oddziały niemieckie przekroczyły granicę polską, łamiąc pakt o nieagresji. Bombardowano szereg miast. Tu Warszawa i wszystkie rozgłośnie Polskiego Radia. Komunikat specjalny.
A więc wojna. Z dniem dzisiejszym wszelkie sprawy i zagadnienia schodzą na plan dalszy. Całe nasze życie publiczne i prywatne przestawiamy na specjalne tory. Weszliśmy w okres wojny. Cały wysiłek narodu musi iść w jednym kierunku. Wszyscy jesteśmy żołnierzami. Musimy myśleć tylko o jednym. Walka aż do zwycięstwa.
This is London. You will now hear a statement by the Prime Minister.
I am speaking to you from the Cabinet Room at 10 Downing Street.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another event at Ognisko Polskie, the Polish Hearth. Dobry wieczór Państwo. Dziękujemy, że Państwo z nami dzisiaj się dołączyli do nas na dzisiejszym wieczorze na temat Cichociemnych. Ladies and gentlemen, you will be hearing a bit of Polish today. If you don't speak Polish, it sounded a bit like that. Most of the event, however, will be in English. Before we start the event, there are a few things I need to tell you about. One of them is that the event tonight is being recorded. So if you're not comfortable as being part of that, please turn off your video. I think we're all comfortable with how we use Zoom now. We're all pretty good at it. And you can turn it off in your where it says stop video on your list. After the presentations tonight, there will be a question and answer session where you can pose questions to the panel. The best way to do this is through chat. And some of you have already sent in email questions. We will try our best to get through as many of the questions as we possibly can. After the event, we don't finish on the question and answer. It's as if we were in the ballroom at Ognisko Polskie and the event is finished. People like to mingle, chat, talk to each other, meet some of the participants of the event. Those are breakout rooms that we'll all be joining afterwards, and I invite you to join us in these breakout rooms. We're calling them komórki tonight. Komórki means cells. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce you to the chairman of Ognisko Polskie, Professor Jerzy Kolankiewicz.
My lords, ladies and gentlemen, and dear club members and their guests. My name is Jerzy Kolankiewicz, and it is my special pleasure as chairman of Ognisko Polskie to chair this meeting this evening. It is special because it addresses historical themes close to the hearts of Poles, and therefore is one of the major aims for the existence of this club. It is special because it sheds light on a subject which we know that for so long has been kept in the dark, or at least in the shade, and gives voice to those for too long and have been kept silent, they and their families. That is the Cichociemni. It is special because of the heroism displayed by the 316 men and women and their supporters in this country, living by their adopted motto, win freedom or die. It is special because of the array and the quality of the speakers who have kindly graced us this evening and who will also shed light and give voice, and in this way contribute to the memorialization initiated by national heritage of the Cichociemni. To lead us through this evening, I would like to introduce Dr. Paul Latawski of the Department of War Studies at the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst, who is eminently qualified through his research and writing on military affairs with special reference to Eastern and Central Europe. If I could just very quickly run through this in Polish, or a version of it. It's Szanowni Państwo I drodzy członkowie klubu. Mam zaszczyt jako prezes klubu przywitać Państwa w Ognisku Polskim. Zaszczyt jest tym większy, gdyż jest to temat historyczny, tak bliski naszym sercom i przez to naszemu klubowi. Rzuca światło i daje głos sprawom, które były tuszowane. Daje głos tym, którzy należeli do Cichociemnych, tak jak ich rodzinom. Wielu z nich, wiemy, się często spotykali w Ognisku Polskim po wojnie i dlatego to jest dla nas specjalne. To heroizm tych 316 mężczyzn i jednej kobiety, którzy żyli według adoptowanego motta wywalcz wolność lub zgin. Te słowa były przyjęte z pełną świadomością i powagą. Dzisiejsi mówcy dadzą nam pełny wkład do tego tematu. Dla nas przedstawicielem tematu, który będzie nas prowadził przez dzisiejszy wieczór, jest dr Paul Latawski z Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst, Department of War Studies. Paul, it's over to you.
Good evening, dobry wieczór to everyone, and welcome to this evening's panel on the Cichociemni. I think we are in for a very special and very interesting evening. We have 7 speakers on our panel who will be telling various parts of the story of the Cichociemni, who are Poland's special forces during the Second World War. Each member of the panel will be speaking for approximately 10 minutes. And when the panelists finish, we will then move to a period of questions and answers to allow every one of you using the chat facility to contribute and participate in a discussion. My first task, though, is to introduce who the Cichociemni are. If I could have the photographs on, please. There are basically 2 important questions that I want to start with. Who were the Cichociemni and what did they do? The name is an important clue, as Cichociemni is translated generally as silent, unseen, which points to their wartime role as secret agents and special forces fighting for Poland's independence. The phrase Cichociemni has a real resonance in Polish, but in English it perhaps would not be a construction that would be used for such a unit. But in Polish terms, these are very, very important people who had a major role in the Second World War. They were trained under the auspices of the Special Operations Executive, which you'll hear more about from some of our speakers, but they were effectively controlled by the Polish government in exile through its general staff. And the members who joined the Cichociemni, and there were very many more who volunteered, but far fewer managed to meet the challenges of the demanding course, which was centered at Audley End. Having those that completed the course and those that actually were deployed to Poland, parachuted into Poland during the war, served as part of the Armia Krajowa, the Home Army, where their specialist skills saw them serve in intelligence, as instructors, leading partisan groups, and other specialist tasks such as being radio operators or in forging documents, which is obviously a very rarefied skill. So without further ado, I think we'll move on in momentarily to our first speaker. And it's with great pleasure that I introduce Ian Valentine. And Ian has done an enormous amount of work on the Cichociemni. He's the author of the book Station 43, Audley End House. This book actually has been translated into Poland with the title Baza Stwierdzieście Cichociemni. He also published a book entitled The SOE's Polish Section. And so Ian will be telling the story of the SOE Special Operations Executive and its connection to the Cichociemni. So over to the floor to you, Ian.
Thank you very much. Firstly, thanks for asking me to take part in this important event. Winston Churchill's mandate to set Europe ablaze is perhaps overused in the sense that it pigeonholes a secret organization that had a myriad of purpose, not just the big bangs. Special Operations Executive, a London base of Baker Street irregulars, spread themselves out into leafy suburbs and to country estates that served as training establishments in underground warfare. Courses instilled skills from a wide-ranging syllabus, anything that might splinter enemy advantage and aid local resistance movements. Country sections were formed representing the occupied territories of Europe. Sir Douglas Dodds Parker, a commander of SOE operations and latterly Member of Parliament, described SOE as quite an association and none better than the Poles. The Polish section of SOE, formed in late 1940, differed from all other national sections in that by 1943, the syllabus became an exclusively Polish affair. Broadly speaking, once SOE trained operatives began missions in Poland, they remained under the aegis of the Polish Home Army, severing SOE's jurisdiction. As we've just heard, these highly trained individuals were coined Cichociemni. The description is elusive both in origin and orthography. The Poles were ambitious and wanted to run a series of sabotage courses for 50 officers at castles in the Highlands of Scotland. The recruits set about mountaineering, living off the land, loosing off high explosives, light infantry mortars and various other weapons, before moving on to parachute training at Largo House and Ringway Airfield in Manchester. Legs were broken and recruits dismissed if they were not up to the task. The training was a serious business. The Poles knew that they were up against, had already seen what was happening to their country and had already had difficult passages to Britain. The sabotage courses at Inverlochy, hailed as a great success, moved from Scotland to Brigham's, Lord Aldenham's 17th century house in Essex, and became the first centre for underground warfare training. It was here that all the forged money and documents were made. One can appreciate the irony of a respectable banker's residence being used for the production of forged banknotes. Courses in intelligence gathering, propaganda, driving, languages, photography, they were all taking place at other secret locations. On the 1st of May 1942, an extensive underground warfare course was operating at Audley End House, which was also known as Station 43. This was under the command of the imposing and famous military figure, Major Joseph Hartman. The house became in effect a finishing school before SOE arrived, and it was a British military establishment under former Shanghai Defence Force member, Lieutenant Colonel Terry Roper Colbeck. The British guarded the estate, served as cooks, drivers, dispatch riders, and stoked the boilers, which was pretty unpopular with the British soldiers. However, they were also involved in SOE field exercises in the Essex countryside. The training lasted between 4 and 8 weeks, and it had to instill fitness, self-reliance, and in the final stages, the ability to be a seamless liar. The last thing a candidate wanted on his training report was unfit for underground work. This curriculum for crime and destruction did indeed mirror the big bangs and ungentlemanly warfare that SOE was famed. There were man traps and mines, heavy explosives, blowing up armored vehicles and tanks, close combat, shooting and fighting with knives, assassination, mock assassination, quick evasion and different types of vehicle. Candidates were set the most fantastic of tasks. Local police and railway stations in Essex were warned they might be subject to sudden attacks. There were also serious accidents and 2 fatalities. Before he was asked to become an instructor, Lieutenant Alphonse Machkowiak, Alan Mack, was given the task of raiding a local post office as part of the course. The postmaster was told of the raid only an hour beforehand. Mack thought of an unusual approach. Knowing that women could move about less obtrusively than men, he asked if he could dress as a woman. Wearing a wig and a dress with a pistol tucked into the top of his stockings, he was dropped from a van near the post office. Strolling into the office, Mack jumped on the counter and pointed his gun at the clerk, stating that it was a raid. A telegram was taken with a post office stamp as proof that he had undertaken the task. There was also the quieter pursuits of map reading, sketching, writing reports, and gathering an intelligence. Training and future missions were heavily influenced by information sent back from Poland, which was studied in great detail. The most pertinent was the information sent back by the first Cichociemni agents who dropped into Poland in 41-42. A student had to pass the underground warfare course before the final briefing course, which lasted a month to 6 weeks. The lecture program covered concocting cover stories and learning the bureaucracy, structure, uniforms, equipment of political, military, and civil organizations at work in Poland, including the Gestapo. Enemy uniforms were worn in mock interrogation exercises that could be sprung upon the candidates at any time of day or night. At the end of the course, all those that were ready to work behind enemy lines took the oath of allegiance customary to the Polish Home Army before they began their service. Pertinent to me really is 20 or so years ago, I worked at Audley End House, and my position was the site ranger in the grounds. This position led to garden tours and questions from the public regarding the secret history of the house. And what I found was many questions I couldn't answer because there was scant information representing this story. Queries from visitors focused on a memorial urn on the remains of the Jacobean Mount Garden. The tendrils of research began, and I basically started to look at and reconstruct Audley End as a secret training school. But I must say that the people that I met there, I was lucky enough to meet Polish instructors and those that completed missions in Poland, a courier, and also a British Army driver. So for me, obviously this couldn't happen now, but to meet these people really created a picture for me. Without exception, none of them let me pay for lunch, as they relayed all their stories to me, or rather part of them, because I think understandably much was kept secret. These people included the aforementioned Brigadier General Alan Mack, who was a founding member of the Polish SOE and Polish Special Forces, and he distinguished himself by his exceptional bravery while serving with the artillery in France. He demonstrated his unarmed combat techniques on me while we were having lunch in a sleepy Essex pub. I'm delighted to say that 6 or 7 people having business lunch in the next table didn't know what to make of it and were completely lost for words. At their respective homes in leafy London suburbs, I met Tony Curry and Tony Nosek, 2 quiet and modest gentlemen. They furnished with information and, of course, Polish lunch. Tony Curry, Lieutenant Anthony Pozbachelski, instructed in German language and radio communications at Audley End House. Pozbachelski had previously been in the parachute brigade and trained in Scotland when he first joined SOE. Tall and scholarly, he was nicknamed Prof. He took part in Operation Freston in 1944. Anthony Nosek parachuted to Poland on 4th of May 1944. His papers, made in Audley End House, were scrutinized by the Gestapo. He was arrested on his way to an underground meeting and was taken to the notorious Montelupi prison. One of the few people to be released, Nosek remained active with the AK, but was arrested by the Russians in 1945. He received the Cross of Valor 4 times. I also met a courier, Second Lieutenant Kazimir Zdanovic, who was one of the 34 SOE trained couriers, and this time it was Polish vodka at 11 o'clock in the morning. Set aside by military command for his work and specializing in Russian language, he arrived at Station 43 in March 1943 at the age of 25. His journey to Russia was protracted and treacherous. Having successfully completed missions, he was arrested by the NKVD for a second time. This time they found his pistol and he was sentenced to 15 years hard labor in work camps and collective farms in Russia. His story was pretty harrowing. I met him when he was 85 years old and he was still suffering from the effects of severe frostbite in his legs. Amazingly, he escaped to Turkestan in 1943 and made it back to the Middle East and then on to Cambridge in England. And finally, Sergeant Alfred Fensom, who was an army driver based at 1943 for a year. It is perhaps his work in the latter stages of the war that remain the most poignant. His journey through Europe was to lead full circle back to his friends at Station 43. After D-Day, he followed up the Allied advance into Germany. Fensom worked with a Glaswegian safebreaker in Berlin, who was employed to open safes to retrieve any paperwork. Fensom told me that the only time that he marched was to get his pay. Fensom described having to enter many different areas of command, but most poignant and disturbing for him was entering Belsen concentration camp, which he did so at the end of the war, dropping off various British officers. He told me that he was asked to look for Polish SOE agents that he'd known at Audley End, and very sadly, he discovered that some of them were indeed in the camp. Just to sum up, really, I just wanted to quickly say that there's a weatherboard barn in a disused airfield at Tempsford in central Bedfordshire, and it's a very unassuming vernacular barn with pitched tile roof. And this was the last stage of a dropping off point for Cichociemni agents. So when they left Audley End House, they were taken to holding stations and then on to Gibraltar Farm Barn, where everything was checked, their destination address, contact addresses, passwords, and specialist instructions, and no other contact was allowed. This must have been quite a dramatic period for them just before their missions, and they were taken there at night, and no other contact was made before the mission. So just summing up, Polish agents suffered an enormous percentage of losses, not to mention the heavy toll on air crews risking the long and dangerous were lost on Polish sorties, and a total of 485 dropped into Warsaw during the uprising. 73 aircraft were lost on Polish sorties, and a total of 527 SO agents passed through Station 43. 316 Chemney, the Polish silent and unseen, parachuted into Poland. In the summer of 1983, Colonel Peter Wilkinson, senior commander in SOE, unveiled the urn at Audley End in memory of the 108 Cichociemni who lost their lives. Thank you very much.
I'm going to get this unmuting right eventually, which is a rather poor show as I'm chairing, but I'll get it right soon. Thank you very much, Ian. Very interesting detail on what was an extremely demanding course, clearly. And I'd like to move on to someone who's going to talk about where that training took place. And it's a great pleasure that I introduce Andrew Hahn, who is the head of the team of historians at English Heritage, where he's worked since 2007. He's actually a historical geographer by training and specializes in post-medieval history, particularly country houses and historic design landscapes. So I assume if you're about to put your major pile up somewhere on 40,000 hectares, he's the man to talk to on what to do. He is also English Heritage Lead for External Research and Engagement and manages a collaborative doctoral award program. And he's been researching Audley End since 2007. So he's going to bring to us, I think, the history of Audley End, the place where the Cichociemni were trained. Over to you, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Paul. Well, what I thought I would do is to say a little bit about Audley End House, and then I'll move on and talk about really the activities of the Polish SOE whilst they were there, in terms of what the spaces that they used and the activities that were happening in different parts of the house. And then I'll go on to say a little bit at the end about the various projects that we have to mark the 80th anniversary of the establishment of Station 43, which is actually coming up next year. So I'm just going to share my screen now because I've got a presentation. Oh, it's popped up already. Right. Whoop. Sorry, my screen's already being shared. So anyhow, I'm also going to start off. I'm going to start off by talking about Audley End House, which is a large country house, a Jacobean country house in Saffron Walden, Essex, which is, sorry, can you advance to the first slide, please? Thank you. Which is a large Jacobean country house near Saffron Walden, Essex, which was built by Thomas Howard, the first Earl of Suffolk, and it's actually built onto the site of Walden Abbey, a Benedictine abbey, which had been lost after the dissolution of the monasteries. And Audley End was owned by the Earls of Suffolk right through until 1745, and then during the 19th century by the Neville family, the Barons Braybrook. And the house and gardens were sold to the nation by the 9th Baron Braybrook in 1948. And so today they're managed as a visitor attraction by English Heritage and have been since 1984 when English Heritage was established. Next slide, please. Well, when war was declared in 1939, Audley End was the home of the elderly 7th Lord Braybrook, pitched here in the centre, with his wife Dorothy and his 3 children, Dick or Richard, Robert and Catherine. And they made Audley End their home. Well, actually the 3 children were born at Audley End, but the family made the Audley End their home in 1913, after it had been leased out for a number of years to a distant relation of theirs, Thomas Ellis, the 8th Baron Howard de Walden. And so the Braybrooks and their young children grew up here in the house in the 1920s and 30s. Next slide, please. Now, as the war impacted on Audley End at quite an early date, because Audley End happened to lie on the one of their main defence lines, which was defending London, the General Headquarters line. That passed directly through Audley End Park, and you can still see evidence of that today, including this pillbox, which is in West Park, and also some anti-tank obstacles which were placed on all of the bridges, including this one on the Fly Bridge. And these were this area was this series of defensive structures was instituted in the summer of 1940 when invasion seemed imminent. And it snakes its way all the way along the River Cam. You can see if you're coming down from Audley End Station, from Wendon Zambo towards Cambridge, all the way along the river there, you'll see these pillboxes and obstacles. So next slide, please. Along with the defensive works, also the kitchen garden at Audley End was turned over to more intensive farm production and food production. And Lady Braybrook's daughter Catherine actually helped out with the land army in the garden there. And also both the east and west parks at Audley End were ploughed up to help with the war effort. And you can see this picture on the right here. You can still see that even in the 1950s there, that the fields there were still being cropped, planted with corn, even at this late stage after the war. It hadn't been returned to its parkland condition. Right, so the next slide, please. Well, Well, the house and grounds were requisitioned for wartime use by the Ministry of Works in 1941, following the death of the 7th Lord Braybrooke. His 2 sons were already at this point in the army and serving overseas, and in fact, both of them were to die during the war. Robert was killed went down with his ship in August 1941, whilst Richard was killed in Tunisia in January of 1943. So during the summer of 1941, the Lord Braybrooke's widow Dorothy and her daughter Catherine had to move out of Audley End. They moved first to the old rectory in Hayden, which is just over a nearby village, which the family also owned. And then when that too was requisitioned by the WAF, they moved into another property at Littlebury in Littlebury Village, which they also owned. So they had to do quite a lot of moving around in those early years of the war. Now, Audley End was initially occupied by British Army units from the local area that was mainly men from the Bedfordshire, Hertfordshire and Essex regiments. But SOE started using the site from October of 1941 as a packing station for canisters that were used to drop supplies to their agents. And then some Dutch and Danish SOE agents came there, and they were the first to have some training at Audley End. The Poles arrived from Brigands, Hertfordshire, as Ian mentioned, in April of 1942 to set up Station 43 as their main training base. And the Underground Warfare Course started operating on the 1st of May. And it seems that the Cichociemni had outgrown their Brigands base. They couldn't fit all of them in there. And this then ended on becoming SOE's main centre for forgery operations. And at any one time, there were around 60 to 80 agents training at Audley End. And by the time that the SOE left at the end of 1944, it's estimated that over 400 agents have completed the course there. Next slide, please. Now, I've just got here a plan of the house, the ground floor of the house. And it's really to explain that a lot of work was actually taking place in the summer and autumn of 1941 before the SOE arrived there. And this involved packing away all the furniture, which was placed into the state rooms. That's the saloon down here, and also the dining room, the library, South Library, the sitting room, and also the picture gallery and chapel. So these areas were all filled with all the fine furniture from the different parts of the house. Then all the fine interiors were then covered over with panelling to protect them. And this was done so successfully that some of the soldiers serving there said they had little sense of the splendor of the interiors, particularly of the Great Hall when they arrived, because it had been so covered over. They also had the Ministry of Works also had to install electricity at Audley End for the first time, because it hadn't been there while the Braybrooks were there. They'd still used oil lamps and colza lamps for their lighting, and they also had to set up a telephone system too. It had been quite a neglected property up until this. The Braybooks had limited money and had not had many of the mod cons introduced. Next slide, please. One of the things that was put in was this partition across the Great Hall, which actually blocked off the Vamber staircase, which leads up. You can see the archways of it in the distance there, which led up to the state rooms. And this served a purpose of actually providing a screen for the fine interiors, but also blocking access to those areas where all the furniture had been stored. And you can see here a dinner. In fact, I think it's a festive dinner held for the President of Poland, Władysław Radziwiłł, which had been held here in the hall in, we think, 1942. So can I have a next slide, please? Well, we're very fortunate that the Ministry of Works produced a series of plans which have survived, showing the layout of the house as they intended to use the rooms while the Poles were there. Most of the house had been put at the disposal of the military, apart from the areas where the Braybooks' furniture was being stored. And we think that the use changed over time a little bit, because the recollections of some of the people that Ian spoke to were actually quite different from what's actually in this plan. But what you can see is that, I don't know whether you can see my arrow here on the screen, but in the center there you have the entrance, which is the entrance on the left-hand side. That was the main entrance that the Poles used to get into the house. And so the bucket hall there was that was used as a guard room, and they had a sentry stationed there the whole of the time. Next to this was the Great Hall, which was used for both lectures and also as a dining room for the officers. For the NCOs and staff, they used their mess rooms were in the museum room and butler's pantry at the north here. The students, the agents, they used the servants' hall and the housekeeper's room to the south. And this was also their sort of place for relaxation and recreation room as well. The cellars were used to store munitions and guns and munitions. They were stored in the muniment room and the cellars. And the British commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Roper Kalbeck, he took over the red bedroom suite, which was over on the south wing, the tip of the south wing there. That was used as his bedroom suite. Next slide, please. You can see here on the second floor, on the first floor, that all the areas highlighted in pink were where the furniture of the Braybrook family was stored. And this included in the long gallery or the picture gallery. And this meant that actually access between the north and the south wing was only possible on the ground floor, not at first floor level. Whereas here in the north wing rooms, these bedrooms here were occupied by the Polish trainers or instructors. And they used the first room here marked with an A as an ante-room. This was Lady Braybrook's sitting room, and this was used as a sort of ante-room or sort of relaxation room for the Polish instructors. Next slide, please. Much of the work, though, that happened at Audley End happened up on the second floor here, where the lecture theatre, the lecture rooms, language training and other courses were held. And also one room up here was used for making forged documents. There was also the room marked as BR16. This was the main briefing room that agents went to be briefed in before going off on their mission. Also the north turret room, which was above these rooms on a sort of on an extra story up a flight of stairs. This was used for making authentic Polish clothes, were tailored in this north turret room, which had the best light conditions during the winter months. And the south wing here was used by the Polish trainees for their sleeping quarters, and they must have been on mattresses on the floor, several men to a room, because the numbers that were up there. The Ministry Works in their document here, interestingly, says that they thought 100 people could be accommodated on the second floor, but I think this was assuming that all the rooms would be used for sleeping quarters rather than for also for training as well. So next slide, please. Now, as well as the rooms used for the use of the house, that also the grounds were used extensively by the SOE. So here you see training going in the grounds. There was an assault course created within the Elysium Garden by Captain Mack, and this included a very challenging rope crossing over the River Cam, when it was the rope stretched between two trees on either bank, and also an assault course through the woodland. When it came to things like wireless training and fieldcraft, that was done in East Park, well away from prying eyes, which couldn't be seen from the main road. Next slide, please. There was also places set aside for recreation. So you see here, this is the parterre behind on the east side of the house, which had been grassed over in the 1930s. And this was laid out with a volleyball court and also was used for football. And you also see there, it looks like some form of sports day type activities with different types of races going on, sack races and three-legged races and things going on in the park to the west of the house as well. So there's lots of different sort of recreational activities. And within the house, the dining parlour was used as a billiard room, and that was used by the Poles during the day and the British soldiers in the evening to avoid too much mixing between the two different groups. Next slide, please. So I was saying a little bit about the British troops. There were British troops stationed here who were responsible for administrative duties and also guarding the house. And they slept up in the north in bedrooms in the north wing of the second floor, as where the training rooms were. And they also used the day nursery, which was used as an orderly room. Next slide, please. And you can see here a picture of the day nursery from 2015, and we were renovating this to turn it into a new interpretation space, dressed up as a nursery. And on the wall, we found some old wallpaper, and one of these wallpapers actually has the outline of a map of, looks like a map of Scotland on the wall, and we think this must have been on the wall when SOE were here, when this was an Audley room, and must have been plotting some of the moves between the different SOE bases, because we know there are lots of bases up in Scotland that Ian was talking about. Next slide, please. It has to be said, though, that there's actually very little in the way of evidence of SOE's presence at Audley End today. We've only been able to unearth a very small number of different instances. For instance, on the left here, you have some graffiti that was found inside a cupboard, the candle store in the coal gallery on the upper floor of the house. And we think it's some sort of list. I'm not entirely sure what that is. I'd be interested if anybody can give me any information about that. Also, in the former briefing room here, we got what looks like the remnants of a timetable on the wall, and then also some tattered remnants of labels indicating guns and ammunition being stored in the basement near to the cellars. There are also some nails stuck into some of the bedroom walls on the second floor, which show where the Poles hung up pictures or maps to remind them of home. And we also, but elsewhere, it looks like a lot of the evidence has been cleared away or painted away. We know, for instance, that the North Turret room had a lot of graffiti in it, but that's all gone now. When I went up and looked, we even shone a light on it, ultraviolet light, to see if there's anything underneath the distemper layer. We can't see anything, sadly, now. It looks like it's been completely obliterated. Next slide, please. As Ian mentioned, though, the sacrifices of the Cichociemni are commemorated by a simple memorial urn, which was erected in the summer of 1983 in West Park to remember the 108 parachutists, many of them trained at Audley End, who lost their lives during the war and its aftermath. And present at the unveiling were the Polish Prime Minister in exile, Kazimierz Sabat, and also the British Defence Minister at the time, Michael Heseltine. Next slide, please. Now, for many years, of course, Audley End has been a place of pilgrimage for former Cichociemni and their families, and also for the wider Polish community in the UK and overseas. And this photograph here shows one of the final reunions of the Station 43 veterans that took place in 1998. Next slide, please. Well, to mark on the 15th of February this year, to mark the 80th anniversary of the first operational deployment of the Cichociemni, English Heritage launched a campaign to gather memories from those who had family connections to Station 43. And we've had a fantastic response to our call. We've had actually 37 different people who've come forward, got in touch with us. And just to put that into some sort of context, when we had other inquiries looking for people with connections to other sites, where we've rarely had more than sort of 10 or 12 people coming forward. So to have actually 37 people come forward to just one newspaper article, it was a fantastic response, and just made us aware of just how much this story resonates with the general public. Final slide, please. So what about our plans? Well, we have plans to mark the 80th anniversary of the opening of Station 43 in May of 2022. And so we've got hopefully a programme of events, but also some new web content and possibly a small display in the house. And we're also setting up a, with our dedicated team of history volunteers at Audley End, we're setting up a sort of oral social history project to try and record some of the memories of those who served at Station 43 or who have some connection with the site, really building on the response that we got in February. And we're really hoping to speak to families of Cichociemni and to local people in this part of Essex who have stories to tell. We're really interested to hear from anyone who's got information to share, if they have old photographs or records from the time, and if they have anything and they'd like to get in touch with us, then if they could just contact me at English Heritage or through Ognisko Polskie. Then I will, the information will come to me, and we can bring more of this interesting story to the general public who come to visit Audley End. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for a very interesting presentation, particularly the providing us with a visual record of where the Cichociemni trained and giving us, I think, a very essential context to their story. Moving on, our next speaker is John Smith, who, after almost 20 years in the teaching profession and a school headship, he joined BBC Radio as a producer and commentator. He broadcast major events throughout England and across Europe, and indeed was one of the 8 producers responsible for BBC Radio coverage for the funerals of Diana, Princess of Wales, and the Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. And on his retirement, he was invited by the late Lord Montague of Beaulieu, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, to create an exhibition honoring the men and women of the Special Operations Executive who were involved with agent training at Beaulieu during the Second World War. And the Princess Royal actually opened the exhibition in 2005.
Thank you, Paul. And yes, I'm going to tell the story of the birth of the Special Operations Executive and take you right through to where, for many people, the story ended in Beaulieu, which is the French name that was given to Beaulieu by the Franciscan monks that lived there back in the 10th century, which means beautiful place. And I think during the course of my talk, you'll find out why it has that name. Nowadays, it's referred to as Beaulieu. So back at the beginning, in 1914, Britain's new Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, he realised that the strength of the British Armed Forces alone could not repel the rampant Nazi occupation of Europe. This country was ill prepared for the conflict, and Hitler stood on the French coastline, viewing Great Britain as his new conquest. Churchill instructed that a secret army be established to provide agents and arms and assistance to the patriots of the European resistance, so that they were better able to fight the Nazis with the aid of unconventional warfare and what we might call dirty tricks. He decreed, as we've already heard, that they should be set about setting Europe ablaze. A steady flow of military personnel and resistance operatives from across the occupied Europe started to slip into Great Britain. They were recruited into this new secret army, the Special Operations Executive, and they were transported to the special training schools, some of which we've heard about already. These were often situated in the most unlikely locations across the British Isles. This training was tailored to the countries, the terrain and the resistance networks in which the recruits would operate. But it was quickly recognised that having completed this specialist training, this personalised training, there was a real need for the recruits to undergo rigorous personal survival training. This would improve their chances of mission success and increase the agent's chances of avoiding capture and the resultant consequences. Short refresher courses would be led by a team of specialist instructors who would then assess the recruits' readiness for missions behind enemy lines. These men would rubber stamp their suitability as SOE agents. So this required the establishment of a special evaluation school. It was set up and adopted the name the Finishing School. But deciding on Beaulieu as the location for this top secret operation was not immediately apparent. So why Beaulieu? Well, a British Army brigadier had served as an intelligence officer during the First World War and retired in 1937 to a little cottage in the village of Beaulieu. His name was Gerald Buckland, and when World War II was declared, he returned to service with the Special Operations Executive. Aware that they were looking for a top secret location for the finishing school, he recommended the Beaulieu estate of Lord Montague. Now, Beaulieu is a heavily wooded area, served only during the Second World War by narrow lanes and dusty stone tracks, many of which led to large country houses nestling among tall broadleaf trees in very secluded locations. So, early in 1941, 11 of these large country houses were requisitioned by SOE. The occupants of these premises were wealthy, well-heeled, and in some cases well-known in British society. A number of them had already vacated their premises for their own safety, and others were persuaded to relocate. So desirable were these Beaulieu houses that one SOE wag actually named them the stately homes of England. Now, the house known as the Rings became the main office and the training headquarters of the finishing school. It was from here that the commanding officer led his team of senior officers and instructors between 1940 and 1945. At the end of a working day, the administrative staff and instructors, they walked down a long gravel track to the house in the wood. And it was here that they relaxed in the officers' mess. The remaining 9 houses served as training schools, each allocated to a different nationality. Between May 1941 and June 1945, numerous groups of Polish partisans were prepared for their missions in the house called the Drogs. Each isolated house received small groups who were taught by specialist instructors who travelled from the finishing school's headquarters at the Rings to instruct the agents in their own isolated locations. Agents in one house were never made aware of the existence of other houses, and the residents of Beaulieu village also had no idea what was going on in these properties. Those that attempted to find out were discouraged by the military guards that encircled each of the 11 houses. The locals referred to the mysterious people in the forest as the hush-hush troops. The home of the Montague family, Palace House, sits at the heart of the village, but during the war was totally out of bounds. It was never used for SOE training or billeting. Inchmerry House in Beaulieu has very strong links with Polish troops and partisans, but was not a requisitioned SOE property. That said, on an Inchmerry stable wall, there is an inscription carved in Polish. It's believed to have been written around the time of the Warsaw Uprising and says, "God help us." The Polish 6th Bureau acquired the building and carried out a certain amount of specialist training on the site. It's believed they did send a number of men for SOE training, but it was carried out by SOE instructors under the finishing school's rules. Not all the SOE instructors had seen military service. In fact, a few had fascinating career backgrounds and were considered a little strange. In fact, one of their number described them as a shoal of pretty odd fish. There was Marriott Doby, who later became librarian at the National Library of Scotland. Donald Killer Green, who taught criminal scale. What else could he be than a chartered accountant? There was the actor Peter Follis from the Old Vic, and Eric Bill Sykes, who specialised in silent killing. There was a tailor and dress designer called Hardy Ames, who after the war designed outfits for Her Majesty the Queen, Queen Elizabeth II. Nobby Clark, the gamekeeper to Her Majesty's father, King George VI, was also an instructor. He taught living off the land. And there was Scotland's most notorious criminal, already hinted at him with one of our previous speakers, a Glaswegian called Johnny Rominski, who claimed he could break the lock on any door, any window, or any safe. The double agent, Kim Philby, taught propaganda at Beaulieu, and he was the one who described his colleagues as a shoal of pretty odd fish. And their training followed an interesting syllabus: arson, assassination, blackmail, breaking and entry, burglary, code breaking and ciphers, disguises, forgery, invisible writing, key making, sabotage, safe breaking, and silent killing. Between classroom and practical sessions, the trainees were taken to the shopping centre in Bournemouth and taught how to lose someone who was stalking them. They were taken at night to the Eastleigh Railway marshalling yards and shown how to blow up railway lines and disable German military locomotives with explosives. Trainees were even taken on all-day physical exercises designed to totally exhaust them. Then they were torn from their beds in the early hours and subjected to the physical and mental abuse they might experience at the hands of Gestapo interrogators. Many broke under this pressure and proved unsuitable for secret missions and were not considered SOE material. Often they were sent to Kool houses, often in Scotland, until the end of the war. Between 1941 and 1945, the Beaulieu Finishing School trained and assessed somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 agents, many of those from Poland, along with those from other occupied countries. We will never know how many served with SOE because at the end of the war, Churchill ordered that every record and account, every piece of equipment used by his secret army be destroyed. There were many heroic figures and those who became legends in their own country, like Jan Piwnik. I was briefed to concentrate on the agent training, as others here tonight will be focusing again on the individuals. But that said, we know that Piwnik spent time at the finishing school and we celebrate his inspiration, leadership and bravery. Beaulieu also played its part in preparing Joachim Ronenberg and his team of Norwegian agents that blew up the hydroelectric plant that was generating heavy water, a mission that severely dented Hitler's nuclear ambitions. Many amazing women also trained for missions in Beaulieu, women like Nancy Wake, the most decorated woman in the Second World War. On completing their training, agents transferred to holding stations before embarking on missions from British Airfield like Thamesford, as we've already heard, but also from Tangmere in Sussex, or they travelled to the coast where they returned to Europe by sea. Sadly, some were captured and died at the hands of the Nazis. But many secret missions were successful, each helping to turn the tide of the war. We honour them, all of them, at Beaulieu. And Cyril Cunningham penned this book called Beaulieu, the Finishing School, about the role of Beaulieu in agent training. Now, the current Lord Montague is the custodian of an SOE Secret Army exhibition, which was officially opened by the Princess Royal in 2005. The plaque you see behind me sits in a quiet corner of the Beaulieu Abbey cloister. The words penned by a former SOE instructor who became a peacetime scriptwriter, songwriter, and film critic. Paul Dane wrote the screenplays for Goldfinger, Murder on the Orient Express, and The Spy Who Came In From the Cold. He also wrote this dedication to all SOE agents who gave so much in the course of peace. Remember before God those men and women of the European resistance movement who secretly trained in Beaulieu to fight their lonely battle against Hitler's Germany, and who, before entering Nazi-occupied territory, here found some measure of the peace for which they fought.
Thank you very much, John, and particularly for the very poignant words of the plaque commemorating those who served in the SOE. Again, a remarkable organization with remarkable people in and of itself. Next up is John McHugh, who's been a military historian and author for over 25 years. He's authored 5 books to date, including Brighton's Secret Agents. He's an active trustee of the Secret World War II Learning Society, a UK educational charity. And in this role, he has lectured at the Ognisko Polskie on the SOE agent Władysław Ważny. He currently specializes in the Special Operations Executive, and is working on a 3-volume roll of honor for the French section of this Second World War Secret Service. Now, he's actually going to bring to us a couple of lesser known elements in the story of the Cichociemni. He'll look at the SOE's EU/P section and their operations in occupied France. And also he'll look at STS, and I hope we'll find out what STS stands for. STS 63 Westcourt, Warnham in Sussex, known as the other Audley End House, that trained the Cichociemni for Operation Bardsey to be sent on operation to French. So over to you, Paul.
Thank you very much, Paul. And I'm going to try and just share screen now with a presentation which I have. So hopefully the technology will work, and there you go. And as Paul said, I'm going to talk about EUP section of the Special Operations Executive, which was active from 1940 to 1945. And I'm doing that in my role as a trustee of the Secret World War II Learning Network, an educational charity in Great Britain. And I, for some reason, can't change the slide. Here we go. Sorry, got it. Just to recap slightly, Ian touched on this earlier. SOE, what was SOE? And people do associate it with Winston Churchill, but the founding charter was signed by Neville Chamberlain, the former Prime Minister and then Lord President of the Council, on the 19th of July 1940. It was one of the last things that Chamberlain did. He was terminally ill with cancer and he died shortly after that. The charter was approved by the War Cabinet on the 22nd of July 1940, and ministerial responsibility first rested with Hugh Dalton, who was a Labour member of the government, and he was the Minister of Economic Warfare. So the idea was to keep it away from the War Office and leave it with give it some independence with the Ministry of Economic Warfare. And incidentally, Hugh Dalton was very proud of his links with Poland and considered himself a first-rate friend of Poland. The charter of SOE was to conduct espionage, sabotage and reconnaissance in occupied Europe against the Axis powers and to aid local resistance movements. And it was then the case that SOE having been founded, Prime Minister Churchill ordered it to then set Europe ablaze. And indeed, it wasn't just Europe, it was across the globe. But relatively quickly, the minister responsible, the Minister of Economic Warfare, was changed. Churchill didn't like the first man, but he liked the second man, Lord Selborne Randall Palmer, who was a good friend of his and was considered more the right-wing sort of person to lead SOE, and indeed he did for the rest of the war. So back to SOE's involvement in Poland, and you've heard a fair bit already about the Polish section for work inside Poland, but I'm just going to pick up on, as Paul said, one of the lesser known elements, EUP, which was known as the Polish Minorities section, and this looked after Polish interests outside Poland, and especially, not exclusively, but especially in France. As Paul again said, I've been an SOE historian, particularly to do with France, not exclusively. I've covered former Czechoslovakia, former Palestine, now Israel. But my main area of research has been in France, and in respect of operations in France, SOE eventually operated no fewer than 6 agencies. The main 2 were F section, the independent French section, which was responsible to the British and under British command and British policies and strategy, and also RS section, République Française, which was responsible to de Gaulle and the Free French. The other sections were DF section, which was an SOE organization that ran escape lines for SOE approved people and agents out of France, and later on AMF section in Algeria, and then the uniformed Jedburgh teams, which were an SOE initiative. And last but not least, back to EUP section, the Polish minorities. I will just touch on F section, the independent French section reporting to British command and its priorities, because there were 2 remarkably brave Poles who served in F section. And I have been privileged in talking at the Ognisko Polskie before, and I covered Stanislaw Makowski, And Claire Mully, who I think might be joining us later in the question and answer session, covered Christina Skarbek. There's a fantastic bust of Christina in the Ognisko Polskie, otherwise known as Christine Granville. And Christina Skarbek survived the war, not for very long, sadly, and Stanislav Makowski was killed in action in 1944 in France. Both very, very brave Poles who should not be forgotten. EUP section, however, established December 1940, around the same time as the country section and Polish section of SOE, first led by Captain Richard Truskowski, who later changed his name to Richard Trusko, much easier for a Brit like myself. And he had served in the British military mission to Poland. He didn't last very long. He was replaced by Major Ronald Hazel in July 1941. Unfortunately, I've been unable to find a photograph of Major Hazel, so if anyone out there has one, I'd love to hear from you. I should add that I've only been covering this topic for a few weeks, and so 10 minutes or so is just about likely to plumb the depth of my knowledge, so it's quite handy for me. I'm going to cover very briefly in the time allowed the main operations and the liaison activity of EUP section. And up until D-Day, 1941 to 1944 is what I call the clandestine period. Three main elements that I can identify so far: Angelica, Adjudicate, and Monica. Angelica was a propaganda and prepare and train for later intelligence organization in France, which had been created in 1940 by the Polish Ministry of the Interior. And when EUP section was formed in late 1940, early 1941, it took over responsibility for contact with the group in France. Monica was a general name for intelligence that started in around September 1941, and Adjudicate was a military element that was added, was sent into France, into occupied France, to add a military element to the intelligence work that Angelica was doing, and in particular to start conducting small-scale sabotage. So those were the three main elements of the clandestine period. I'm going to share with you a document, and as you'll see later on, we have Anthony Massey with us talking about his father, who was in SOE in Polish section during the war. For a moment, when I discovered this letter on a file from the National Archives just the other day, I thought for a moment it might be his father, but it's not. It's one of the other two or three Masseys who were in SOE. You don't have to try and read the letter. It's a handwritten letter by Lieutenant Jerzkowski, who was the first person of Adjudicate dropped into France on the night of the 2nd, 3rd of September 1941. And as I said, he was charged with carrying out small-scale sabotage, etc. The entire mission of Adjudicate was undermined by the fact that no supplies were dropped to it until the 23rd of April 1942. So there was something like a 7-month delay before any supplies were dropped. However, this chap managed to create cells of Poles who'd been left behind in France, particularly Poles who'd served in the Polish army, and particularly across Vichy France. You'll remember that only part of France at that time was occupied by the Germans, and the Vichy government was operating in the other half. So he created numerous sections, which were called the NUMI organization across France. And it's said that he covered in the end 22 départements, 22 counties in total, with something like 65 cells or groups, who must have been kicking their heels in frustration, given the fact that the British didn't drop any supplies to them for 7 months. However, the organization was blown after only a few months after the first supplies arrived. It was considered blown and written off by both the Polish and British authorities by the summer of 1942, so only a few months after that first supply drop in April. And the failure of the mission was blamed on security and jealousy between Angelica and Adjudicate, and also bungling by Angelica and allegedly high living by some members of a judicate. Now, whether Lieutenant Jacobean was one of those, I don't know, but he managed to get back to Britain, and gradually many of the people who had been his local recruits in France, as I say, many of them from the Polish army, they all managed to evade either down through Spain or into Switzerland and also get back to England. And when they got back, he took a group of them out for a meal. And he was later reimbursed for this meal. And although you can't particularly read perhaps the writing there, it was typed up. And I'll just read out, note on point 2, although the sum of £1 per day is the officially prescribed sum, yet in this case, as the superior of my officers, I thought fit to receive them after their experiences. So this is after they've got back to England from occupied France. And the work they did not do in cheap restaurants, but in a way customary with us Poles, i.e. more expensive. I therefore refuse to accept the sum of £5 offered to me. Please report the above to Brigadier Gubbins. Remarkably, they did report the matter to Gubbins. That's why it's typed out, and it went up to Gubbins, and he actually wrote a letter back to the lieutenant, giving him fairly short shrift and telling him where to go. Just as an example of the Monica organisation, which continued on despite the failure of Adjudicate and Angelica, one person I talked before about at Ognisko Polskie, and this was Operation Davistow A, Captain Vladislav Vaishny. He was decorated with the Virtuti Militari, Chevalier de la Légion d'honneur by the French, Croix de Guerre by the French, and Médaille de la Résistance by the French. We offered him a certificate of commendation, which was actually turned down by the British authorities for political reasons. I've no idea what they were, but he was a very brave man. He parachuted into occupied France in March 1944 into northern France, which was stiff with Germans at the time. And he reported for attack or destruction 17 trains, 60 enemy positions, including the general headquarters of Field Marshal Rommel, and sent around 180 radio messages back to Britain, identifying 162 V-weapon launch sites. And his section itself destroyed 2 rocket launch ramps, a rocket launching crane, and power cables, and that was supplying the launch sites. He didn't survive. He was killed in action in northern France in August 1944. And I just briefly touch on him to give you an example of the brave service that was carried out by some members of EUP section still in the clandestine period. The main planned but abortive operations of EUP are then 2. Bardsey, Operation Bardsey, which is going to be in France, and Operation Dunstable, which was due to be in Germany. And this is where we come on to the second relatively unknown element of my talk, STS 63 Warnham Court at Warnham near Horsham in West Sussex. And STS stands for Special Training School. And it's one of those stately homes of England, which John Smith mentioned earlier. This one was only taken up from September. Actually, I think it's probably May 1943 from what I can make out, but became fully operational in September. And indeed, just in the last 2 weeks, a fellow historian, SOE historian of mine, some of you will have heard of him, Stephen Kipax, he discovered STS 64, which is previously unknown. It's just down the road from Warnham, in a house called Chudley in Cox Green in Rudgwick. So I'm about to get in touch with the owner and try and cover that a little bit more. But it seems to have been taken up, and it was under the command of Warnham Court as they ran out of accommodation and space just a few miles down the road. I hate to admit it, but I lived only a few miles up until the age of 21 from both these places. I never knew a single thing about them. So the commandants of STS 63 and 64. First of all, over on the top right-hand side, you had Lieutenant Colonel Hudson. He didn't last long. He wasn't seen as a commander of men. He was replaced by Major Edgell, and he in turn was later replaced by Major Harper. So just 3 commandants through the period of the war. And thanks to a chap called Rafał Niedzela, who I've been in contact with in Poland in just in the last week or so, some fantastic photographs of Warnham Court. And here you see two people on sentry duty outside the front, having a good time in the grounds. Group on the steps. And the oath. This is one of two photographs where they're on parade and taking the oath. Fantastic photograph there. And they're taking the oath as well with the Padre out the front. And I noticed they've got the American flag flying, and there were some American personnel there as well. I can't see the Polish flag, but there was certainly 3 American teams and 1 British team attached to the Polish troops who were training for Bardsey. An original plan for Bardsey was that they would go in on the night before D-Day to support the invasion, but that doesn't seem to have got very far, and eventually the plan was for them to be dropped into northern France just in advance of the advancing Allied armies. They'd be in uniform. They'd be more like SAS troops or Jacobean teams. But again, that was overtaken by the swiftness of the Allied advance, so they didn't go in. The final element which I mentioned was Dunstable, and some of the men who were trained for Bardsey also then trained for Dunstable, if they could speak German. So German, Bardsey was for French-speaking Poles, and Dunstable was for German-speaking Poles. And the idea with Dunstable, which overlapped in its training at Warnham Court with Bardsey, was that German-speaking Poles would be sent into Germany to protect German workers and to protect Polish workers and Polish prisoners of war as the Reich collapsed, to undertake intelligence activities and economic sabotage. But again, the war overtook them and they weren't used. So there were 2 big uniformed elements who weren't used, but as I put there, I do think that we should be looking at a plaque to these men at Warnham Court. And indeed, according to Professor Michael Foote, who wrote the SOE history, SOE in France, there was something like 28 EUP agents who were sent in to France before D-Day, and of those 7 did not return, so 25% losses. And I would very much like to see a plaque on the house, as I say, and I hope that's something that my organisation, Secret World War II Learning Network, can facilitate. I'd like to finish with thanks to the gentleman I just mentioned a moment ago, Rafał Niedzela, who sent photos and documentation information, Stephen Kipax, who did some files, and there's some sources, including Jeffrey Bynes, Michael Foote, who I've also mentioned, and Bogdan Rowiński. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul, for another fascinating presentation. I'm very struck by this point you made about the SOE records being ordered destroyed, and I think it's actually quite a remarkable challenge to try to piece together the history of an organization whose records have been destroyed. And I suppose this is where we come back to the point made earlier by Andrew about this English Heritage Project to collect accounts from family members and friends. And we'll have a bit more to say about that at the end, but I think there's a great opportunity to fill in blank spots with information that may reside with families and in other places. But we must march on, and thank you very much again, Paul. And next up is Marek Mrożek. He's a geophysicist by profession and is a trustee director of the Polish Institute and Cichociemni Museum, a place I know well as a historian, something of a second home for me, the reading room. And it's just around the corner from the Ognisko. And I think he's put together a presentation looking at something that I think is an important element, the Polish angle of the Cichociemni, particularly looking at their psyche, providing something of a context of the time and the society that they emerged from during the Second World War. So, Marek, proszę bardzo.
Thank you. Good evening. Dobry wieczór. First of all, I'm speaking as a Pole. Some people might expect me to romanticize what I'm saying. And I'd like to assure you that we're talking about the Cichociemni. We're talking about the Polish underground army during the war. This is deadly serious material. No romanticizing, although some of it might appear so. I was fortunate enough to have my undergraduate studies at Imperial College in the physics department, just across the road from Ognisko. So that's one of the reasons to be fortunate. The security guard in the physics department, the Blackett laboratory, was a large man. I don't mean fat man. I mean a very strongly built, tall man. We called him Spike, another pseudonym. That's because of his crew cut. And he was a deadly serious man. All the professors, the staff, and the students had him in awe. Total respect. You walked through that door and you had to deal with this gentleman who was doing his job very properly. One day, going into the department after hours, he challenged me with, "Are you Polish? Are you Polish?" And I said, "Yes, of course. By my name, you must know my name." He knew every student, every professor, every staff member by name. And very soon, the little chat we were having, he came out with, "Your generation is not tough and not as clever as my generation." So I asked him, "What were you before you became a security guard?" Of course, generals became bartenders after the war, right? So he said, "I was a Cichociemni," and I understood that straight away. Why did I understand that? Because while my friends at English school were playing cowboys and Indians, we Polish boys were playing partisans. We were playing AK versus the Germans. It was a completely different upbringing in terms of the mythology, the legends that we had to deal with. And he told me that I wasn't as good as he is. So I said, "Maybe not, but I'm sure you can teach me." Before long, I was standing on the bottom step of the staircase and doing a PLF, a parachute landing fall, rolling on the ground, the heavy wooden parquet floor. And within half an hour, I was standing on his security guard's counter, doing a leap onto the parquet and rolling. And at the end of that, he acknowledged, "Okay, you'll do." I didn't know what for, but I said, "Of course, it's part of my DNA." And may I have the next slide, please? Or in fact, the first slide. That's the introduction slide. The next slide, please. So the Polish DNA is something that, after that frivolous comment, I've been thinking about and chatting with friends for decades now. And I've come together with some themes that I consider make up the psyche of the Cichociemni. These aren't unique features, but they do together, taken together, exemplify what sort of person the Cichociemni was. The first theme is the Poles, directly before the First World War, before 1918, had undergone 123 years of partitions by the Prussian, the Austrian, and the Russian Empire. We're talking about, there were no Polish schools. You could not talk Polish on the streets, otherwise the authorities would punish you. 123 years, however you calculate it, it's about 4 or 5 generations. We'll go on to that. What did this 123 years of clandestine life, living underground as a Polish nation, what did that do to the psyche of the population? The second point, the expectation of fighting for independence. The expectation was that I would be a soldier. Now, whether that's a man or a woman, built up over generations, we are expected to have a tough fight of it in our lifetime. And the third one, the tradition for fighting for your freedom and ours. That's collaborating with other nations in a common cause. And the fourth one, the ingrained facility for improvisation and making do. We don't, as a nation, expect things to be delivered. We make them work. So the next slide, please. 123 years of clandestine life. What does this mean? It may seem romantic. We played clandestine life as boys in the Polish Cub Scouts. This is a nation that is living its entire life in secrecy. A couple of years ago, a friend's father died, went to the funeral, and at the wake, we went to the friend's house, and she had a box of photographs that her father had left behind. This is her father. This is one of the photographs that a pal who's sitting next to me leaned over, poked me in the ribs and says, "Marek, what do you think he's wearing?" And I looked at it and immediately said, "That's a denizen smock. That's the absolutely quintessential uniform of a British Army paratrooper in the Second World War." And my friend asked, what did you say? What's he wearing? A denizen smock? What does that mean? It means he was a paratrooper. And she did not know that about her own father. Her father, as one researched later, was a Cichociemni. He completed the training, but did not jump. So he was one of the 600 who trained, but did not jump into Poland. He didn't even tell his family about his true story during the Second World War. Why is that? Why the secrecy? Apart from it being in the DNA, Polish secrecy continued for almost 200 years, from the first partition of Poland from the third partition of Poland in 1795, pretty much until 1990. My father considered himself not to be released from the military oath until 1990, until the free elections in Poland put Lech Wałęsa in the seat of president. This secrecy, why the secrecy? It's because you are still required. The war has finished for most of the Allies. For Poland, it is not yet complete. I have been trained as a Cichociemni. I have been trained in special forces. I may still be needed. And this belief continued for the next 20, perhaps, years. I may be jumping into the People's Republic, the communist regime controlled Poland, and carrying out the job for which I was trained. That secrecy needed to be maintained. Besides which, I had family in Poland. If the communist authorities in Poland discovered that I was a Cichociemni, they may be under risk of arrest and persecution by the Polish communist authorities. So that is the cause for the secrecy beyond the end of the war in 1945. And I think that perhaps explains why so little has been known until recently. People haven't been writing books and investigating the Cichociemni, and that's because that secrecy has persisted. And I maintain until 1990, more or less. Now we seem to be more free to talk about it. So that's the 123 years of partitions where Poland continued a full life. It continued not just maintaining cultural legacy, but continuing that cultural heritage through the new manufacture of literature, of practice of fine arts, of music, either within Poland itself or overseas, like Chopin and others like him. The education of Poles in Polish was forbidden in Poland. They carried on in private houses, after school. You got together, you read Polish books, you learned about Polish history. A large role was played by women in this. The women, the babcias, the grandmothers, particularly coached, taught their children to in Polish verse, how to pray in Polish. They taught the Polish history. That Polish identity not only survived, but thrived for 123 years. This doesn't fit into my head. This is serious organization, which we'll see will come back in 1939 when Poland goes underground. For 200 years, Poland lived in secrecy. The Polish life, the Polish cultural, not yet, please, but for 200 years, Poland lived in secret, apart from those 20 years between the First and the Second World Wars when the Polish Second Republic was formed. And now the next slide, please. Thank you very much, Tomasz. So here we have the pink bar. It's a little timeline. I'm going on to my next theme now, the expectation of fighting for independence, which was built up over many generations. So we have back in 1795, the third partition of Poland, 123 years, the pink bar. Poland does not exist on the map. It's controlled by the Prussian, Austrian, and Russian empires until 1918, when Poland won back its independence, and the Second Polish Republic continued from then until 1939, when Poland was invaded first by Germany on September the 1st, and then by Russia 17 days later. And the fight for independence, look at the timeline. The years are divided into those little shaded boxes. In that time, the red bars show the uprisings. So these are times when the Poles rose up in arms against the partitioning powers. We have the Kościuszko uprising, the first one, various uprisings in Wielkopolska, in Kraków, in Lwów, in Śląsk. You can see the frequencies of these uprisings. This leads your normal average young man and woman in 1939, at the beginning of the Second World War, to realize that my father and my grandfather and my great-grandfather, they all fought for the freedom of Poland. My expectation isn't just to get through school, get some higher education, perhaps, get a good job, raise a family, and so on. My expectation is that at some point in my life, judging by the previous 4, 5, 6 generations, judging by previous Polish experience over the last century and a bit, my expectation is that I will be dodging bullets and artillery shells and saber thrusts at some point in my life. These people were expecting to be fighting at some point in their lives. So next slide, please. The third theme is also inculcated in that generation, is the concept of fighting for your freedom and ours. That's a phrase that most of us know very well in conjunction with Polish history. For your freedom and ours. If you look at the slide, the greenish, bluish greenish bars at the bottom are where Poland is fighting for her own freedom in conjunction with her allies. Apologies to the British, but not really. But the Poles fought on Napoleon's side during the Napoleonic Wars. Why? Because Napoleon was fighting the Prussians, he was fighting the Austrians, and he was fighting the Russians. So the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So the Poles allied themselves with Napoleon's forces. One of Napoleon's marshals was Poniatowski. So they did all they could to support the Napoleonic cause. Long interlude, and then the Poles, in sympathy with the Hungarians, who also rose up against the Austrian Empire, the common enemy, the Poles went and fought in the Hungarian uprising. Józef Ben was a general. I think he was, in fact, the overall commander of the Hungarian uprising at the time. World War I was an ugly, messy time. Why? Because Poles were conscripted by the occupying, the partitioning powers into all three armies. So you had Poles in the Prussian, in the Austrian, and the Russian armies. Poles found themselves on opposing sides. Members of the same family were in uniform, armed, fighting across the trench from another member of the family who's in a completely different army on the other side. Is that a tragedy or what? But these concepts were understood by Poles. These were understood. You may be in a different uniform to mine for a while, but we have the same common cause. Our aim, our goal is to fight for Poland at some point. And that's again something that has happened for generations, fighting for another country's army in another country under different country's command. And that came again to a head in World War II, when the Polish armed forces first found themselves in France, but then in the United Kingdom using British equipment and being dropped as Cichociemni into Poland using British Air Force crewed planes. So the next slide, please. The fourth theme, I've highlighted, again, this is not a unique theme, unique to Poles, but the Poles had an ingrained ability to improvise and to make do with equipment and in the conditions that were available to them. Poland was, in between the wars, between the First and the Second World Wars, a poor country. It had been denuded and robbed by the partitioning powers. The Poles did not have, although they supported each other economically, setting up Polish businesses during the partitions, and there was social welfare going on. The Poles made do with what they had, and they knew that had by necessity had to be limited. They were very inventive. What we have here is a few examples from the Cichociemni Museum. The big thing on the right is a transmitter, a radio transmitter, which was intended to be delivered to Poland, to the underground, for communication with the chief of staff, who was in London at the time. So the Cichociemni would have been intended to use this radio equipment to communicate with London. In the end, in the Polish uprising, which the Cichociemni took a large part in the end, the way you communicated from the north of Warsaw to the south of Warsaw, because of lack of communication equipment, you signaled, encrypted, and then signaled to London. London would then decrypt and re-encrypt and pass that message on to South Warsaw. This was very much an improvisation and making do. Had repercussions, but the Poles set up an entire underground state, not by improvisation, but by design. The Polish government in London had representatives and ministers in Poland, which controlled or managed all aspects of life. Apart from the military, apart from the AK, apart from the Cichociemni, there were printing presses. What you see there in the middle in that black frame are microfiche of the Bulletin Informacyjny, which was a daily newspaper published in Warsaw under the German occupation. There were a number of newspapers appearing in daily editions, which would be then passed around. This microfilm would have been sent by courier to London, so the Polish government in exile would know what was being published by the underground press. Little cigarette cases where you could keep messages if you were collared by the German police on the street. These are places to hide things. The thing on the left, the little drum, the width of the drum is about 15 centimeters. That was a printing press. That was in action in occupied Warsaw for 24 hours a day. They were publishing books. For those of you who may have read Squadron 303, about 303 Squadron's participation in the Battle of Britain, that book was written by Arkady Filler in 1941, very soon after the Battle of Britain. That book ended up being reprinted in 4 editions in the Polish underground state during the war. So you can see the whole organization, that improvisation, making do, living in secrecy, was something which was inculcated in the Polish mind, even in 1939. Do I have another slide? I think this is the last slide. So this was just done to illustrate where the Cichociemni came from. The themes that governed their upbringing, the things that they picked up from their parents, grandparents, these were part of their psyche. This is what they played as children, and their expectations were to be trained overseas, perhaps, but to go in fighting. And when they were asked, do you want to jump into Poland? The invariable answer was a very quick, without hesitation, yes. Some had reasons not to. And there was no shame associated with that. But the 2 gentlemen that I've mentioned, very tough men. I can't compare with that. To live that life in secrecy, not just to keep away from the enemy and keep yourself safe, but to work against the enemy, to fight for your country. That's the sort of stuff that the Cichociemni were made of. So I invite you to engage in conversation with the next Polish security guard you come across, and continue the conversation discussion that way. Thank you.
Marek, thank you very much, providing, I think, a very vivid Polish perspective of what motivated the people who joined the Cichociemni. I think that's a very, very important part of the story. And because as a historian, I get rather frustrated at how sometimes Western historians reduce all Polish military activity to, frothing at the mouth fanaticism and craziness, etc. The books on Monte Cassino that have been written quite illustrate this theme, when in fact you're talking about real people who have had a lot of important historical influences shaping their lives, much like there are influences that shape the history of lives of British people as well. So thank you very much for that perspective. Finally, we have one more speaker to go before we move on to questions and answer. It's with great pleasure now that I introduce Anthony Macy. He's a former journalist with the BBC who specialized in international news for more than 30 years. I wonder if he misses it or you get worn out by it. I'm sure it's a never-ending flood of events. But his father, Lewis, was a British officer in the Polish section of the SOE, while his grandfather, Bernard, was actually the first director of the Ognisko Polskie. So Anthony will be bringing a very personal family connection to the story of the Cichociemni. Anthony.
Paul, thank you very much for that introduction. And yes, a personal connection, but also one that very much draws on the themes that Marek mentioned just now of the motivation for Poles and people with deep Polish roots for the way that they acted in the Second World War. So if I could have the first slide, please. And yes, one on from there. So at 9 o'clock in the morning on the 1st of September 1939, my father, Louis Massey, went into Poznan from the family home just outside the city to have his hair cut. While cutting his hair, the barber observed casually that the war had started that morning when the Germans had invaded Poland. Didn't Ludwig know? Next slide, please. Louis and his parents, Bernard Massey, who was English, and Irena, who was Polish, had certainly known that war was imminent. Everybody did. Poznan was, of course, rather nearer the German border then than it is now, and everyone assumed it would be in the front line. What to do about it was another matter. Bernard was a professor and head of English at Poznan University and at Mickiewicz University, as it is now. They all had British passports, but their roots were in Poland. At 11 that morning, on his way back home, my father watched the Luftwaffe bomb the Polish Air Force base at Wawitce, now Poznan Airport. This was only 5 kilometers from our house. The next slide, please. For the rest of that day and the next day, the family waited, not wanting to abandon their home. During that time, the Germans pushed into Poland north and south of Poznan, bypassing the city and leaving, for the moment, a route out. Eventually, Bernard, Irena, and Louis decided they could wait no longer and packed everything they could into the family car, as the Germans would come sooner rather than later from the west and the north and the south. They went east, joining tens of thousands of refugees jamming the roads. At that moment, and for months to come, they had no idea if they would live or die, still less how they might get back to Britain. Louis, then aged 20, while getting his parents to safety, wanted to do something for Poland. He had no idea that there would be a way through an organization which did not yet exist, SOE, Special Operations Executive. Next slide, please. 8 months later, in April 1940, the family reached London after a perilous journey across Europe. There, Louis and his father Bernard did 2 apparently unrelated things which led directly to Louis joining SOE. Louis volunteered for the British Army. Bernard, as you've heard, was appointed the first director of Ognisko Polskie, a club where Poles who had escaped from Poland could meet along with British who had Polish connections. Not that SOE was mentioned when Louis joined the army. He was asked if he had any particular skills. Well, he spoke 6 European languages, including being bilingual in English and Polish. And what would he like to contribute to the war effort? Louis replied simply, anything to help Poland. The army seemingly took no notice. My father joined the Royal Artillery as an ordinary soldier, a gunner, and did his basic training on Salisbury Plain. Then in spring 1941, when his unit was just about to be sent to Burma, about as far from Poland as one could imagine, he was told, not you, Massey. All his fellows went to the docks to get on a troop ship to sail to the Far East. He was left behind on guard duty at Woolwich Barracks. Some weeks later, Lewis was summoned for an interview with an army officer, a major in central London. The officer seemed familiar, as though they'd met before. As Lewis said to me, the interview was all very friendly, but it was, as he put it, so oblique, so obscure, that at the end of it, he had no idea what the officer had been talking about. At last, someone was interested in Lewis's helping Poland. Good. Lewis's languages would be employed, doing translation work, which was fine, but sounded a bit tame after training for battle with the Royal Artillery. There was talk of codes and of working at a requisitioned stately home. Lewis felt rather out of his depth, as he was a linguist, but knew nothing of codes. Then out of the blue, the major asked Lewis what he thought about parachuting. Lewis replied he'd be happy to stay on the ground, but he was in the army and it was wartime, so he'd do whatever he was told. None of it made sense. Next slide, please. It made even less sense when a few weeks later, Lewis was told he couldn't stay as a gunner, an ordinary soldier in the artillery. He needed to become an officer now. So he was sent on an officer training course. This he passed, and he emerged as a lieutenant and later a captain. At this point, he was told he couldn't stay in the artillery either. He had to transfer to the infantry, but he could join any infantry regiment in the British Army. Lewis chose the Sherwood Foresters. I asked him why, as the family have no connection at all with Nottinghamshire. Lewis smiled and said, "I like the name." So, as a newly minted lieutenant in the Sherwood Foresters, Lewis was ordered to report to an office in Baker Street in central London, to the headquarters of the Inter-Services Research Bureau, which he'd never heard of. When he got there, he was asked to fill in lots of forms and had his photograph taken and was given an identity card for the headquarters building. He was told he now joined the Inter-Services Research Bureau, which he'd never heard of, but not told what it was or what it did. Then Lewis was taken into another room where a group of senior officers were sitting around a table. They told him that the Inter-Services Research Bureau, which until this morning he'd never heard of, was the cover name for SOE, Special Operations Executive, which he'd also never heard of, and that he was in fact now a member of SOE and specifically of its Polish section. As such, he would be an intelligence officer working with the Polish government in exile in London and with 6th Bureau, the Polish military command in London, who directed the operations of the AK, the Armia Krajowa, the Home Army, the Polish Resistance, and Lewis had certainly heard of all of them. Lewis would be helping to train and support Polish resistance fighters who would be parachuted back into Poland to join their comrades in the AK, fighting the Germans. He would be sharing an office with, as it turned out, a Major Richard Cichociemni, who Paul McHugh mentioned just now, who became a close colleague and a good friend. And sitting opposite Lewis at that moment at the table in Baker Street was the same officer who conducted that incredibly oblique and obscure interview that Lewis hadn't understood. He turned out to be Major Ronnie Hazel, and he was now Lewis's immediate boss. And that's how you join SOE as a British officer in 1941. At which point the pieces in the jigsaw come together. SOE was a new organization set up to wage war in a new way, primarily by organizing and supporting resistance movements across Europe. It was necessarily secret, hence the cover names. The most senior commanders in the British Army did have to know about it, but for all that Churchill backed it to the hilt, they didn't necessarily like it. SOE was not just new, but unorthodox, disruptive. They didn't understand it, so they didn't want much to do with it. Commanders were most unlikely to send their best people to join it. So, how do you recruit for a secret organization without much official help, where it's vital to get the right people? You ask your friends. The more I spoke to Lewis about who the British were who ran the Polish section of SOE, the clearer it was that they had key things in common from before the war. They all knew each other, or at least they had friends in common. While they included Anglo-Poles like my father and Cichociemni, they were all, including both of them, British citizens. They all already spoke Polish, some, like Lewis, exceptionally well. They all had a deep personal connection and commitment to Poland going back years. They had lived and worked in Poland as diplomats, businessmen, academics, journalists, military attachés. Lewis, as the youngest, was probably one of only a couple who had grown up and been to school in Poland. But Major Ronnie Hazel, the British officer who had conducted that incredibly obscure interview with my father and who was now his boss, was typical. He had been British Vice Consul in Gdynia at the same time as my grandfather Bernard was British Vice Consul in Poznan. Ronnie and Bernard will have known each other well. Ronnie probably visited our house in Poznan, and they certainly met from time to time at the embassy in Warsaw. Could I have the next slide, please? And that brings us to another key factor linking the British in the Polish section of SOE. The British community in Poland in the 1930s was not big, and for that reason it was quite closely connected. All of them must have known my grandfather Bernard Massey, now the director of Ognisko. He and my Polish grandmother Irena were prominent in the Anglo-Polish world of that time. Our house outside Poznan was always full of interesting and influential people, Polish, British, and others, where conversation in several languages would encompass history, art, books, and politics. In many ways, our house was a kind of prototype Ognisko. When Bernard, Irena, and Lewis arrived in London as refugees in the late spring of 1940, they found a good number of their friends and contacts, Polish and British, were already here. So without Bernard even necessarily realizing it, that will have made Ognisko a very useful conduit for recruiting people to SOE. If I could have the next slide, please. In Lewis's case, and here's Lewis with Bernard just after the war, in Lewis's case, Ronnie Hazel will have known that Bernard's son was in town and had talents useful to SOE. One can imagine Bernard telling him so himself over lunch at Ognisko. And Ronnie was evidently able to step in just in time to stop the army sending Lewis to Burma when SOE needed him to help Poland. It was a good move. While Bernard promoted good relations between the British and the Poles at Ognisko, Lewis became the liaison officer between SOE and the Polish government in exile and between SOE and 6th Bureau. Next slide, please. As such, Lewis was an inspired choice. As far as the people in the government in exile and 6th Bureau were concerned, Lewis, or Ludwig as they knew him, was a Pole who just happened to be an officer in the British Army. He didn't just speak the language absolutely perfectly, he came from Poznan, while his family on his mother's side were from Galicia. His uncle had fought with Pilsudski's legions at the Miracle of the Vistula in 1920. He knew the history, he understood the politics, he shared the jokes. And like the other Poles in London, Lewis had fled the Wehrmacht and the Luftwaffe under fire to continue the fight from Britain, leaving family and friends and home behind. He knew what it was like because it had happened to him. As he did all his life, Lewis Massey spanned 2 countries and 2 cultures, belonging in both. Thank you. Paul.
Thank you very much, Anthony. That provides a very interesting perspective of actually, a rather unusual individual in the sense of being both Polish and British, fully in every sense. And I think that must be an absolutely unique position. And I suspect if you're in that position, you see the virtues and the faults of both the British and Polish people in with wonderful balance, if nothing else. Again, thank you to all the speakers. And now we're going to be moving on to the question and answer part of this evening's program. And perhaps while our audience is thinking about any questions they want to put to the panel, which again, please do so on the chat function. What we're going to do, we have a couple of individuals who are going to kick off our Hearthside question and answer session by posing their questions to the panels. And the first is Jeffrey Bynes, who himself has written on the Polish SOE, a British perspective. So Jeffrey, if you'd like to pose your question to the panel, and I think whichever one of the member of the panel wishes to tackle his question, please go ahead.
Well, actually, Paul, I don't have a question at the moment, but I would like to, at some stage, to talk to Paul McHugh about his research into the EUP. So perhaps at some stage you could let me have his number. And I also like to speak the last speaker. Was he aware that Richard Cichociemni's daughter was still alive and living in London?
Yes, I was aware of that. I haven't been in touch with her lately, but of course, Cichociemni, or Trusco, as I'm sure you know, he went off to New Zealand and then he died in Australia about 12 years ago. But yes, I was aware that the family are still in England.
Yes.
Well, I think, Jeffrey, you can probably in one of the rooms at the end have that conversation with Anthony. But if you want to join the panel and tackle some of the other questions that come up, you're most welcome. And our next person we want to spotlight concerning the questions is Claire Mully, and I think you members will remember her from her work that she's done on Christina Skarbek. And so Claire, if you want to put a question to the panel.
Well, first of all, I just want to say I found that absolutely fascinating and fantastic, and thank you all very much. Very different perspectives, and I just want to go and talk to you all a lot, especially Jeff, who's just down the road. We both live very close to Audley End House, as it happens. So my question, I've got about 10, but anyhow, I'm very interested, as people who know me know that I'm very interested in the women's stories. And of course, there was one female Cichociemni who has been mentioned, but not by name, Elżbieta Zawaka, or Agent Zoe. And I've got a lot of questions about her. So I just would like to know, she was a courier mainly, and absolutely extraordinary, the only woman to get from Warsaw to London during the war, as an emissary to reach Sikorski, in fact, and pass on information. Was she also involved in collecting that information herself? Did she even know what was on the microfilm that she was transporting? Or for security, perhaps, was she kept away from knowing the information that she was smuggling? I'd like to know about her intelligence contacts. Did she know people like Kazimierz Leski or Bradel? And what was her role later in the Warsaw Uprising after she became the only female Cichociemni parachuted back to Poland? And I've got lots of other questions about what happened to her family. Apparently, I've heard, but I don't know if this is true, that one of her cousins became a judge after the war and was involved in the trial of Polskie. So I've got many questions. Could the panel answer some of those, please?
Shall I pick one or two of those up?
Oh, please do.
It's Marek here. So Elżbieta Zawacka was a courier, as you say, and it's in that capacity that she came over from Poland overland to the United Kingdom, to the Great Britain. She, over the course of her career, had actually crossed the German border over 100 times. We're talking serious activity here. There was some kind, and she was responsible for the courier routes. That was her job. And she knew them inside out, a lot of them, because she'd done them herself. Now, there was some kind of trouble in getting those courier routes connected from Poland to the United Kingdom. And there was difficulty in that. They had to communicate on that level with London directly. That's why she traveled over Germany during wartime, over occupied Europe to France, into Spain, and then Gibraltar. So it was a long route, and she made that on her own steam. And she was to liaise with the Polish government about setting up those routes to making them more efficient. That was her primary role. And there was also a lot of information that she carried. Now, whether she was party to all that information or not, I would say the answer is necessarily yes, because the way she operated was not with microfilms and high technology. She memorized everything. So however many courier routes they were trying to reopen between Poland and Great Britain, whether that's going through Scandinavia, whether it's going through the Balkans, with all the border crossings and the contacts and everything, she memorized all of that. So if she was carrying other information to London or on her other missions, those other 100 missions plus, she would memorize all that information. A prodigy of mental achievement here. And maybe that answers some of your questions.
Thank you.
After the war, whether one of her relatives was a judge in the Polskie case, I have no knowledge of that, but I would be very surprised because Zor, after the war, was actually arrested by the security forces, was sentenced to 10 years in prison, served 4. So it's unlikely that she would be, that one of her relatives would be in a privileged position as a judge.
That's why I thought it was so interesting. Yes.
Yeah, but I don't have any knowledge of that. I can't remember what other questions you asked.
That's a good
I'll
start.
shut up then.
Thank you very much indeed.
I would like to add, because I'm a Cub Scout leader myself, that she was an eminent Scout leader. You're interested in, so do you speak Polish? Are you a Polish speaker?
Sadly not, but I will be going to Torun with a friend or two to go to that museum.
I'll tell you why, because it's very sad. You need to, do you have any Polish friends, Polish English speakers?
Yes.
Great. Tomasz, I sent Tomasz, Pan Tomasz, the gentleman who's facilitating all the technology here for us today. I sent him a link to a Polish radio website, which has 3 interviews with Zor, with Elżbieta Zawadzka. Of course, they're in Polish, but we're talking a couple of hours of actual spoken narrative interviews with Elżbieta Zawadzka. You listen to her voice, and she is the Girl Scout leader that she was. It's a very mellow, gentle voice. You try and put that in context with her wartime activities, and it simply doesn't gel. She's such a nice, sweet-sounding lady, such a gentle woman. And the way she tells her stories, I would recommend yourself and anyone else who's not a Polish speaker to get onto that. Maybe Mr. Tomasz, Pan Tomasz, you could put that, you could share that link to the Polish radio website. I would get your friend to give you a verbatim translation of what she's saying. Spend a couple of hours over it. It's a great enjoyment.
Thank you very much indeed.
I think if I could compile them all into one bundle of related questions. The first was that how many attempted the course to join the Cichociemni, and how many actually passed. Those 300 that didn't drop in Poland, or the ones that didn't drop into Poland, what did they do? What happened to them? So whoever would like to go first.
I just say, in response to the question, for instance, the EUP Cichociemni who weren't dropped as part of Bardsey or Dunstable, that they would simply return to the Polish Free Forces. And perhaps one of the other members of the panel can shed more light on it after that. But that's what I know, that when they weren't used, they were sent back. There is an indication that some of the Dunstable people ended up operating around Dinan in Belgium, but it was very, very small scale. But the vast majority was simply sent back to the Polish army in exile.
I'll chime in on there as well. I've actually, the Cichociemni that I've met were actually all Cichociemni who didn't jump. And as you say, they were returned to unit. And any Pole that was returned from the Cichociemni training to unit was done without any semblance of shame. There's one example where one of these men were asked quite late on in the training. He'd done all the physical training, he'd done his jumps and so on. He was badged, And then before he moved to his final training, I imagine that would be in Audley End, the final training where he gets his, no, he actually had his pseudonym by then. He had his alias. And then he was asked point blank, would you be able to slit a German's throat without hesitation if you needed to? And he replied, no. Now, why was this? Do you remember I was mentioning that a lot of the Poles in the First World War served in the uniform of Prussian, Austrian, and Russian armies? They were Poles, but they were conscripted into the army. After 1939, Poland was split into two parts by the Germans. The western part went directly into the Reich, so we're talking Silesia down south and Pomerania in the north. These were incorporated directly into the Reich. The eastern part of Poland, the far eastern part was taken over by the Russians, but the middle part, with Warsaw and so on, were taken over and made into a German administrative unit called the Generalgouvernement. Now, the part that was taken into the Reich, the Germans considered all the residents there to be Germans. Therefore, they were conscripted into the German army. And if you were approached of an age to be conscripted, you're going into the Wehrmacht. Otherwise, the consequences are your entire family would end up in a concentration camp. The choice is not something that can be taken lightly. A lot of Poles went into German uniform, taking the earliest available opportunity to escape out of there. Now, one of these, the one I talked to, was the one who came over to the Allied side. He was captured as a prisoner of war in Tobruk early in the war. And he could not slit the throat of a German soldier without hesitation, because that German soldier might be a Pole or a Czech who had been conscripted. And he was returned without shame to his unit. These people tended not to carry on in SOE or in some kind of special unit. Why? Because they were spalone, they were burned. In other words, they'd been exposed to the top secret stuff. You didn't want them to fall into German hands. A lot of them ended up in Scotland, doing useful jobs, but not jobs in which they might be captured by the enemy and therefore reveal the secrets of training, the secrets of the organization of the special units. Sorry, I hope that answers some of your question. Oh.
Okay, I'm trying to get in as many questions as possible. There's a couple of questions that relate to the reception that or what happened to the Cichociemni when they arrived in Poland. One is concerning, I think, were they ever treated with suspicion by their initial contacts as being double agents, where perhaps they were too well equipped and aroused suspicion? Were there any problems with Cichociemni sort of being received in Poland by their colleagues? And the second one is shifting into the post-war area. And Kim, the questioner points out Kim Philby was mentioned at Beaulieu. Is there any evidence that he was informing his Soviet masters of SOE Cichociemni activity that would have had an impact on what happened in terms of persecution of Cichociemni in after the war? So over to anyone who wishes to tackle this.
I jump in, if I may, Paul. At Beaulieu, this question arises a large number of times, and the straight answer is we don't exactly know, but it's worth remembering that, of course, Russia was one of Britain's allies, and there's every reason that the allies were working together, and there may have been an exchange of information and secrets. But with the passing of Philby and his silence to the death, we will never know.
Okay, thank you. And anyone else want to shed any light on any of these issues?
I would just add that not particularly about Philby's contact with Poles, but certainly in terms of his contact with Russians, he was used for interrogating Russians who turned up at the Royal Victoria Patriotic School, MI5 London Reception Centre. And I mean, I haven't been able to link the two things together, but he certainly did interrogate Russians who came to Britain. So he therefore knew who was likely to be used by the intelligence services. And I'd be surprised if he didn't pass the information on to the USSR, because I've also seen evidence that SOE were putting sleeper agents into places like Murmansk in northern Russia under cover of naval signals officers and things like that. So SOE were playing an early long game, which of course came to nothing because they came to nothing in 1946. But Philby was in a very good position to at least let the Russians know about people who were working for SOE.
If I can just chip in as well, because probably more of an issue than Philby for the SOE was, for the AK, was simply the Russian hostility to the AK on the ground and to Polish independence generally. And my father had personal experience of that when in 1944, when he went to Poland with an Anglo-American military scientific mission to southeastern Poland, examining the V2 rocket test site, which the Russians had just captured from the Germans. And in a moment of glasnost, they instantly regretted. They invited the Americans and the British to help them look at this site at Blizna. And my father, unknown to the Russians, was also there to liaise with the AK, who had, of course, been spying on this site since the Germans had built it in 1943. And one of the things that both he and the AK people had to deal with was the fact that immediately after the Red Army came NKVD officers who were there to both enforce a prototype communist regime on the Poles and to look out for anybody who showed any signs of independence, and especially membership of the AK. So this was a very present danger from the moment the Russians arrived in 1944.
Thank you for that. We've got another interesting question that has come in from a member of our audience. I wonder if a member of the panel could explain whether the Cichociemni also existed before the Second World War in Poland and in other theaters during the war, or were they exclusively a UK SOE creation?
Hello?
Hello, yeah, go ahead, anyone who wants to tackle this one.
Yeah, it's Ian here. I presume that it was created in conjunction with Polish SOE during the Second World War. That was my assumption, really. So there's a differentiation between Polish SOE as a section of the main broader SOE, and then they were the people that were the training up the trainees to become the Cichociemni. That was my understanding, really. And I just wanted to make a point about one of the questions earlier, as well, is that just very briefly, I think two reasons why a lot of the Cichociemni didn't drop was that I imagine that Polish intelligence was so good that a specific mission at a specific date, if circumstances in a particular part of Poland changed, that mission might become null and void. And then that, coupled with bad weather conditions for the long flight to Poland, that might mean that a specific mission then wouldn't take place, and the tide of war then quickly changes.
I'd pick up on that as well. And I would say that the initiative, the concept of Poles landing by parachute in Poland was absolutely a Polish idea very soon after the fall of Poland. They knew that once they had gone into France already, the Polish government had retreated to France and the general staff had moved to France, that they would need contact with Poland. Already the germ of the idea of communications with Poland occurred, and there was two, Kalinkiewicz and Górski, two Polish officers, came out with the concept of dropping into Poland by air, opening up the air route. And this had been studied by these people and other officers, and the plan was already seeded there. And the British also had been thinking in those terms, maybe not about Poland, maybe more specifically in terms of France. And those gelled together. Clearly, the Poles did not have the resources on their own. The Poles relied on the British equipment, on the specialist British training in terms of picking locks and so on. We didn't have many Polish criminals over here. And I understand the SOE opened up Wandsworth prison to the criminals so that they could train the SOE operatives in safe blowing and safe picking. So the Poles had established the idea beforehand. They needed absolutely the support of the British, least of all to provide the Whitleys and Halifax aircraft to drop the Cichociemni into Poland. So that was a marriage of ideas and a marriage of resources and skills.
I think it's also worth remembering that British paratroop forces didn't actually start until the Second World War. So I would think it's unlikely that something existed in Poland before the war. But certainly the Poles seem to have been the most enthusiastic people to get back to their home country by parachute. And Operation Adolphus, I think, was the first SOE parachute operation when Cichociemni were dropped into Poland. And there's a lovely book by the first commanding officer, who was this RAF officer. And if you can get a secondhand copy of this book, it's called Prelude to Glory by Maurice Newnham. And he's the man who set up the parachute training school at Ringway. And you tend to forget that we didn't have forces like this. So in terms of the training, it was completely new. And he does mention the Poles going through there and being some of the earliest trainees. So top marks for eagerness, I think.
I'll again follow up on that and build on that. And I can't remember which year, but I think it was 1938. There was a big Russian military display or so on, at which General Wavell for the British was witness to. And I can't remember, but it was a drop of several thousand, maybe 2,000 Russian paratroops. And General Wavell thought this was an opening for a future military force. The Poles as well recognized this as the way to go in modern warfare. And they trained people in Poland before the Second World War in parachuting. It was more sporty rather than the actual tactics of deployment of an airborne force. However, the Poles had already worked out the military details of dropping a military force. The British training in Ringway started off with the British paratroop dropping and landing on both legs separate by a shoulder's width. The Poles had already developed the parachute landing fall, the PLF, where you land on two legs together so they don't break, and then you roll. And they had statistics to support that as a method. So it was cross-fertilization of ideas. Certainly the resources and the weight of ideas came from the British, but the Poles also were developing specifics, which then they married with the British parachute, with the British Airborne initiative. And I think that was a good marriage in the end.
Paul, just a very quick intervention, if I may. One of the things we have to keep in mind is the context of Polish intelligence activity across occupied Europe. Cichociemni and his people who worked on intelligence cooperation between the Polish and the British concluded that 48% of all information, that is over 39,000 articles, came from Polish intelligence across Europe. So they had a structure of intelligence, which I presume fed into SOE. And there are some little stories which have come out in that report and which were then used to inform on the activities of the Cichociemni. So whereas these are very important people, the actual scale of Polish intelligence, which fed into this country during the war, far outweighed the 300 and odd people parachuted in, and had a far greater impact on the outcome of the war. Much of it, of course, depended upon the AK in Poland, which had its own intelligence structures, as well as people placed as sleepers within Europe prior to the outbreak of the war, who served absolutely first-class function in terms of the needs of this country. So whereas I think it's really brilliant that we focus upon these, they're, as it were, the visible part of the Polish effort, but there was much, much more going on underground with a lot of bases that many of you will know. If you read those two massive tomes, which Jan Cichociemni, amongst others, was involved in, you'll see just the scale of that work that was being carried out. So it's just a question of some balance, as it were, of intelligence activity in general on the part of the Poles during the war.
I'm very glad, Professor, that you mentioned that, because there were some books published by very eminent British historians in the last several years, which ignore the Polish contribution to the intelligence gathering in Europe completely. In fact, they criticize it as being up under scratch. I think in France, certainly at the beginning of the war, the vast majority of French resistance were actually Poles. We heard earlier today there were the three organizations, Adjudicate and Monica and so on. There were others, Poles who were resident in France. This was the so-called early immigration in the 19th century. Those Poles who were working in the mines in France and so on, they already had an organization. My Cub Scout leader was actually sent as part of naval intelligence from Poland to Metz to organize the Polish scouting organizations. This was directly under the command of the Polish armed forces, but these were the scouts who were in France and Belgium at the time, who were organizing intelligence cells in France and Belgium well in advance of the Second World War.
If I can just jump in as well to say that my father, in working in SOE as a intelligence officer, I think one of his roles, and he had a number of different roles, was actually to assess and process. Interestingly, working with his colleague Richard Trzaskowski, with whom he shared the office, who had a similar role, assess and process information given to them, to SOE, by the Poles. So the Poles were very much, all the way through the war, for SOE, a key source of information, guiding both their strategy and their policy.
Thank you very much.
Right. We've as we've been dealing with this particular set of questions, there's been something of a flood that has come in. So what I'm going to do is try to bunch some of the questions, and if I could get sort of rapid fire responses from whatever member of the panel wishes to tackle them. One questioner says that I think a friend has a pillbox in a garden as a feature near Audley End, and you know, the question is, what were these things actually going to be used for? And then the second one is quite an interesting question in terms of unpeeling the history of where the SOE was trained. Has there been any use of metal detectors on the site to see if there's anything archaeological that could perhaps tell some of the story? A question about basically primary source documents. Are there lists of who attended which courses at the training center? A question for Anthony specifically, if he has written or is writing a book about his father, And I think if the panel can remember any of those questions, could you please tackle them?
Yes, Andrew, I'll come in and answer some of those.
Okay.
In terms of the pillboxes, they're very much likely to be part of the general headquarters line, which, as I say, passed all the way along the valley of the River Cam. And I know of pillboxes right from Wendenzambo Station, which is near Wendenzambo to Audley End Station, right the way down past Audley End, past the home farm towards Littlebury. And these have all been plotted by Historic England using aerial survey techniques, and they've done a thorough plot of all the fortifications along that route. And this was all part of a line of fortifications put up in 1940 at the time when we feared a German invasion, and it was really to prevent troops coming from the east, landing in East Anglia, and then coming down towards London from the north. Thankfully, they weren't needed for that purpose, but during the SOE period, we're not aware of them being used specifically by the Poles, although they may have been used in some training exercises, but we haven't got direct information about these pillboxes actually being part of their training activities. In terms of the metal detecting, we haven't used metal detectors at Audley End, but what we have done is we've had a thorough geophysical survey and magnetometer survey of the grounds in the park. That's basically you drag a large magnetic device over the whole of the parkland, both sides of the River Cam, looking for anomalies which would indicate buildup of metallic objects. And we have found a number of high resistance areas indicating that there may be something down there, but we haven't actually dug down to have a look. I do know that in the 1970s, when they did some draining of the River Cam in the Audley End area, they did find munitions and ammunition in the water there, which had to be disposed of by the Army Bomb Disposal Unit. So there was ammunition that they found in those in the river that must have been part of from the activities of the Cichociemni when they were there.
Yeah, it was a gentleman called Ted Pretty that worked at the house that relayed quite a lot of those stories about, they're quite frightened about whether the stuff was live in the river. As regards the training reports at Audley End, there were quite an extensive file at the NMR relating to training reports in 1943 to 44, I think, that detailed all 16 courses, 16 parts of the underground warfare course. So that was quite an interesting read to look at those that passed the course and those that didn't.
Okay, and can Anthony, the question about whether we can look forward to a book or it's out there and you need to advertise it better.
I wish it was out there. No, not yet. No, my father, God bless him, he died only in June last year at the fabulous age of 101, still full of memories and stories to the end. And yeah, a book would be a great idea. There's a lot of material. I recorded a lot of his reminiscences with him about 10 years ago, and we went through diaries and maps and things. And I thought I had assembled most of it until his passing. And now you go through everything. And I was discovering new photographs 2 days ago. I found another diary a short time ago. I haven't even started on his wartime letters yet to Bernard. And that's without talking to people like the Polskie Institute, like Ognisko, like the historians like Paul McHugh, who will have information that I certainly don't have. So there's a lot of research to do. But yeah, I'm biased, but I think he's got a great story, and I'd like to tell it.
Well, we certainly look forward to when it comes out. Finally, I think actually we're coming to a kind of natural conclusion, and I think there's a question that's been posed from our audience that I think is perhaps a good question to finish with. Why is South Kensington, or SW7, so important in British and Polish spy history? And why did the Ognisko Polskie end up there? So over to you, panel.
This is really one for the Ognisko people, but I do know that the building was given them found for them by the British Council, who were the ones who set up Ognisko, and so it was as much as anything because the building was available in Exhibition Road and had belonged to Nunes, who was an heir to the Nunes publishing fortune, and so it's kind of almost a historical accident that Ognisko is where it is, because a large and rather beautiful building was available, and the British Council could make it available to Ognisko in 1939, and then I suppose a kind of magnetic effect happens, and people gather, and one thing leads to another.
And on that note, and I think we'll assume the other part of the question is simply classified information that we can't divulge on this occasion. Many thanks to the panel. Just to wrap up and draw a few strands together, I would urge, one of the striking things about the chat contributions is the number of people who tell stories about family members or people they know. And it is so important to capture this information. And I would just like to really emphasize that, English Heritage has set up this project to collect information, your stories, any photographs you might have, certainly even questions. Your questions might open a line of inquiry that's quite important. So please, certainly, I think you can find information about this on the English Heritage website, but if you wish, email any information to the Ognisko, and it will be passed on to English Heritage for collection and collation. This is really quite a really important thing for future generations, and speaking as a historian, often this is a gold mine of useful primary source information that sheds light, particularly on a subject where records have not been kept, and the very secretive nature of the activity means it's harder to find out what went on. And so I'd really like to finish, if I could ask for my one concluding slide to be put up on the screen. There we go. I think it's quite important, to the legacy of the Cichociemni. And I'm very struck by the fact that today in Poland, the Polish Special Forces have adopted the Cichociemni as part of their tradition, and the Polish equivalent of the SAS is called GROM, the Grupa Reagowania Operacyjno-Manewrowego, the Operational Maneuver Response Group, and they take as unit patches the word Cichociemni, an emblem similar to the Cichociemni wings, and of course they even use the kotwica, the anchor symbol of fighting Poland during the Second World War. And I think this legacy is very, very important. And I was very struck. I've got a memoir of someone who was in a Cichociemni, and he quotes a speech that was given by a fellow member of the Cichociemni, Lieutenant Bronisław Czapczak-Górecki. And Górecki, giving a talk about the Cichociemni, said this: "Engraved on our military insignia is the deep and meaningful call to arms for our country. It is the same for all Poles today at work during peacetime as it is during war. We hope that the young, independently minded generation of today and tomorrow will embed this call to arms into their hearts and into their minds. Only then shall our aims have been achieved." And I think this is rather poignant way to end that highlights the hugely significant legacy of the Cichociemni. So thank you all for listening, and I think it's over to Professor Kolenkevich.
Thank you very much, Paul. My first wonderful duty is to thank you for leading us through this evening. This is, quote Churchill, this is not the end, it's even the beginning of the end. I think it's just really the end of the beginning for our discussion around Poland and things Polish, as we've said, see the light of day and maybe need more, as it were, elucidation. I'm grateful to all of our speakers, and they've come to it from so many different angles. I've been to Audley End quite often, and I do find it quite a lovely place to be, Saffron Walden as well. And I have a pillbox opposite our window on the River Colne, so I now have some idea of what that may have stood for. But I want to go back to the very beginning, and that is, I want to pose the question of where does the name come from? It's all well and good saying Cicho, quiet, and Ciemno, dark. But if you look at the IPN webpage, it does provide a much more mundane explanation of why they were called Cichociemni. That is, these young people were trained largely in Scotland, where the name emerges, and they took part in manoeuvres. And I remember from my army cadet days, many, many years ago, these manoeuvres were carried out in the dark, and all important was you kept stum. You even did all of your compass bearings in the dark. So you had to be Cicho, and it was carried out in the Ciemno. And so therefore, this group of people, the initial trainees on the ground in Scotland, as it were, combined these two words, and gradually the mythology overlaid the, as it were, the normal reality of maneuvers as soldiers who would then become, in some sense, working as on the ground as special forces. And that in itself evolved into the beautiful title, much greater aura to it, of Cichociemni, which we saw Paul adding to the discussion as part of the Grom insignia. I throw this out to you because I really, if that isn't the explanation, I would like to see where the two words came together, Cichociemni, to people at a particular time up there. IPN seems to think that it's a good source, I myself as well. But the last word is to thank Anya, to thank Julek, Yola, Tomasz, and the whole team at the events crew, as it were, who brought us another fantastic event. We have several more here, and I really look forward to welcoming you all and all of our club members before we break out into the daylight ourselves from our own, as it were, period of darkness, seeing the light of the screen. And once again, thank you, Paul. Thank you to all of our speakers. And I hope that we meet in the club and can carry on our discussions in a more, in a less veiled and mediated sense. So thank you very much. And finally, you now break out into, I'm told, the komórki, cells, subgroups, call them what you like, where you can continue as club members and guests and speakers to continue the discussion in smaller working groups. So thank you again. And those who are leaving, good night. Those who are staying, good conversation. Goodbye.